Good morning, everyone. I apologise for a slightly late start, so I will move on quickly in this seminar where we're going to talk about the use of data to support biodiversity net gain assessments. If I could have the next slide, please. My name's Robert Lee. You can see from the slide that I'm a professor of law. I'm not going to do my usual thing and talk about the law relating to BNG, but I will talk a bit about the BNG process and some of the challenges that face local planning authorities. Most of all, however, I'm going to talk about data and try and explain to you very quickly why data is so important in this area. It's a very data-driven process. Next slide, please. So if I just talk a little bit about the BNG process and move through these boxes, we see in box 1 and 2 that a great deal of work will go on in support of the planning application. The biodiversity gain plan, box 3, occurs after planning permission, but there's an awful lot of information that filters into the planning application. We'll need a baseline assessment of the development site, plus a viability assessment for it. And those assessments may impact on design, especially where we're looking for some on-site net gain. Where we're going off-site, we might need to review local nature recovery strategies. And we'll certainly need a plan of any on-site habitat at the relevant date to submit with our application. If the application goes in and is approved, then it will be necessary to submit a biodiversity gain plan. And that plan will have to include a statement of how we've tried to minimize the adverse effects of development on the site that we are developing. But it will also include a pre and a post-development biodiversity value calculation on site. And if we're moving off-site for any net gain, it will have to spell out that appropriate gain, or at least it will have to point to biodiversity credits that we have purchased. And it will be necessary for local planning authorities sometimes to actually secure legally that promise of net gain. On-site, usually through planning conditions, but where we're going off-site, quite possibly through a planning obligation, a Section 106 agreement, or through a conservation covenant, although largely they won't fall to local planning authorities. And all of the off-site gain sites will be registered, and so it may be necessary to check the register and see the recorded allocation of off-site gains to a particular development, and to check that that value matches that stated in the biodiversity gain plan. And then finally, in the final box, this long-term management and monitoring of the conditions or obligations that we've put in place, and the enforcement in the case of breach. Next slide, please. And this poses certain obvious challenges. I mean, it adds another layer to the planning system. There's potential cost and delay, but for local planning authorities, there's significant work to do in quite a tight turnaround period, notional at least 8 weeks turnaround for the biodiversity gain plan approval. And there is a worry, I think, about the lack of capacity here, particularly in relation to trained ecologists. Although biodiversity net gain is new, assessing the ecological impact of development is by no means new. So quite a large pool of those trained ecologists are already tied up in existing work for developers. And there is an issue as to how we'll support the planning system. There's also an issue of seasonality, and I won't say much about that because I'm sure other people will talk about it. But really, rather less than half the year is available to do effective on-site assessment. And therefore, it could lead to bunching of applications unless we find some solutions. And finally, there's the cost. of carrying out assessments and monitoring. Now, of course, local planning authorities have been given some funding to support the recruitment and positioning of ecologists and specialists to support biodiversity net gain. But monitoring will build up over time and will become quite a task. Next slide, please. So I just want to very quickly talk about the importance of data. It's very important to understand that local planning authorities have a biodiversity duty under Section 102 of the Environment Act 2021. And that's rather a proactive duty in terms of identifying opportunities for biodiversity gain, communicating this whole net gain process to the development community, and even facilitating net gain by perhaps matching landowners with developers. And as I've said, pre-application, there's an awful lot of biodiversity gain information needed, checking on-site values, producing a plan that will accompany the planning application, or pointing to places where there's irreplaceable habitat in the development site, which will then trip into habitats regulations assessment. And the biodiversity gain plan itself will have to have pre and post development biodiversity values. So all of that will need to be calculated to ensure that the biodiversity net gain objective is met. And as I say, this will all have to be secured by legal agreements. So we will need data that can form a sensible basis for planning conditions or for planning obligations. And finally, of course, the monitoring, and the monitoring goes on for maybe 30 years. And we will need data for enforcement action. So everywhere, this is a data-driven process, and the people who follow me are going to show how some of that data can be generated. Beginning with Maureen, who's going to show how ecologists can generate ecological assessments from the available data. Over to you, Maureen.
Thank you very much. So I'm Dr. Maureen Berg from the University of Brighton. I'm a lecturer and plant ecologist, and just following from what Professor Lee kind of giving a bit of context, I just want to reiterate some of the new technology that we can use and that have been used in a lot of mapping. So looking at mapping of natural and semi-natural habitats is really kind of increasingly required for any kind of environmental kind of assessment policies, you know, for spatial planning, land management. And this requires a lot of time, sometimes quite time consuming. It's got maybe a very restricted window in terms of kind of species identification and so on. So that's when we can try and tap in some very new technology that have been used in other areas such as precision kind of agriculture, but that's where remote sensing give us an opportunity to go kind of beyond the just kind of the time frame that we have. And there's a wide range of application that can be therefore kind of well, we can use this kind of technique. So we look at, you know, kind of monitoring, we look at a wider landscape approach. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of the principles of remote sensing, and also how does that interact with kind of vegetation, which is quite key for habitat classification. And then after, I'll just give you a kind of little example of how that has been used in other habitats. So can I have the next slide, please? So remote sensing is the process of acquiring information about objects or any kind of areas from a distance. So we're looking at sensors, so kind of that are placed on satellite, and those satellites will go and collect information and kind of around planet Earth. We have been using this quite extensively already in the past, using different types of sensors when you think about aircraft, drones, but satellite images goes kind of beyond just the visible kind of images that we can get. On two satellites, we've got different types of sensors, and we classify them in passive sensors and active sensors. So a passive sensor is called as such because they detect any kind of radiation that is generated by the sun, and this is going to be reflected reflected off any kind of physical surfaces. So we're just kind of looking at sunlight, how it interacts with an object, so it can be a leaf or a tree, and then looking at the message that is sent back and captured by those sensors. This is kind of our current kind of Landsat images and so on. We also have active sensors. So those one, however, provide their own source of energy. So the sensor emits a signal which interacts with a physical object, and the area and is reflected or diffracted by that particular kind of object. That active sensor allows us to look through, for example, cloud cover or any other kind of occlusion that might, I'll say, affect the sunlight that is sent through. But if you think about those satellites that kind of turn around and orbit around the planet, they have they are within about 700 to 800 kilometers in terms of altitude. And this is, for example, Landsat or Sentinel-2 kind of images, and as they go in orbit, they capture a wide range of data, but also they have, if you want, kind of a band that is about 300 kilometers, so that covers a good spread, very kind of large landscape scale, but also they kind of come back every 2 to 3 days. So that allows us to have a very good, I'll say, temporal kind of data, and also we can use some kind of previous data, so we can see changes throughout the seasonal growth or any kind of aspect of that. How does that interact with vegetation? So can I have the next slide, please? So it's all about wavelength. So obviously those kind of that light that is emitted by the sun, we see only a small fraction of it is what we call the visible spectrum, as you can see at the top, but actually there's quite a wider range of wavelengths. And when we look at how plants interact with wavelengths, they will absorb specific wavelengths, and that's going to be used for photosynthesis, so as you can see in the graph below, but they're also going to reflect certain wavelengths, and based on the sensor, and they can capture those kind of differences. And the particular kind of say usefulness of the remote sensing is that they can capture anything that what we call in the near infrared. So can I have the next slide, please? So here I've got my wavelength at the bottom of my figure here, and I have the reflectance. So that looks at the amount of, I'll say, what is reflected from the physical kind of substrate or plant in this case. And you can see kind of the visible spectrum, which is on the far left of the diagram. There's a little bit of kind of reflectance in terms of percentage, but the big bulk of the reflectance comes into the near infrared structure. And that near infrared kind of wavelength amount of energy that is reflected by the plant is going to be dictated based on the type of species, its leaf characteristic, its moisture content, the size of the leaf, and so on. So from there, we can start to discriminate different types of species, or at least different types of communities or habitat type. And this is really what is going to be kind of fundamental when we use kind of remote sensing. So just to finalize that and give you an example, if I could have the next slide, please. Using that information and that kind of technological tool, here's an example where they looked at small marsh vegetation, where they looked at reflectance or spectral signature, which that's how we call the amount, the reflectance from different species. And in this habitat, they have managed to obviously identify different plant species based on their signatures, so their different kind of lines. And that allowed the kind of research here to obviously determine the species composition. Obviously, this is salt marsh, it's got very few kind of species in this case, but looking at the remote sensing kind of images, they were able to kind of ground truth and give them an accuracy of greater than kind of 75% in this case. So it's not a case of it's replacing ecologists, but I think remote sensing could be a really good technology that could be used alongside ground truthing to give us some kind of baseline, as well as kind of information in terms of temporal scales or even kind of much larger spatial scales. And this is just a kind of principle that's been used for this project. So I'm going to pass it to Richard. Thanks.
Thanks, Maureen. That was yeah, that was really useful to have an overview of technically how satellite Earth observation works. So I'm Richard Flemmings, CEO of Map Impact. We're a landmark partner supporting their Biodiversity Net Gain reporting. So if we move to the next slide, please. So just to build on some of the comments that Professor Lee made at the beginning, the opportunity that we saw within Map Impact was that there is a real shortage of ecologists within the community for supporting the Biodiversity Net Gain legislation. And that's what led us to look at producing a nationwide biodiversity, habitat and condition layer, which I'll come on to show some examples of in a minute. But again, building on some of the things that Professor Lee said and Dr. Maureen said, is some of these advantages of using satellites, and we don't think that satellites can remove the need for ecologists at all. We know that there's still a need for ecologists for local site visits, and Sam will come on to talk a little bit more about that later. But the point here is that satellites are a very useful tool within the workflow because of the wide areas that they cover. So if we move to the next slide, please. When we start to think about measuring biodiversity, so we start to think about some of the things that Dr. Maureen demonstrated around how we can measure plants and how they're behaving. We've begun to think about how we can apply that into measuring biodiversity. So this diagram is really it's produced as an outcome of what DEFRA, how DEFRA go about measuring biodiversity. So DEFRA have a tool called the Biodiversity Metric Calculator, and that essentially outputs a biodiversity unit for each location. And that biodiversity unit is created by understanding habitat size, strategic significance, habitat distinctiveness, and the habitat condition. And I'll come on to talk a little bit more about this in a slide or two's time, but the place where we've really focused at Map Impact is around habitat condition, because this is a very, very challenging part of the workflow to understand. So if we move to the next slide. The basis of what we're doing is to understand habitats nationwide, and the way we've done that is by creating what we call a best available habitat layer. And that's taking open data sources from a variety of different places, bringing them all together and creating this best picture of habitat across the country. We've taken all those habitat layers and then aligned them with UK HAB, which is quite important. UK HAB are the classification system that goes behind that DEFRA calculator. Map Impact are a UK HAB partner, so it's really, that partnership is really important for us because it shows that everything we're doing is aligning closely with how DEFRA are mandating this work. If we move on to the next slide, what we begin to see is some of the complexity when you start to think about condition. So what we're seeing in the table on the right hand side is an extract from the DEFRA calculator, and it's relating to grassland in this example. And traditionally what would have to happen here is that an ecologist would have to visit site and answer many questions about grassland. And what we've looked at is whether these can be replicated using remote sensing and satellite approaches, and that's what we've done with our approach. So we've used all of those measurement methods and the indexes and the infrared spectrum that Dr. Maureen talked about, and we've applied that to habitats across the country to understand condition. If we move to the next slide, this really begins to show why condition is so important. So this is an example of some habitats within the DEFRA metric calculator. And if we imagine that we have this multiplier of 1, 2, or 3, depending on condition. So if a habitat's in poor condition, it's scored 1. If it's in very good condition, it's scored as 3. This can make an enormous difference to the number of habitat units. Recently, we've seen DEFRA begin to put prices against the cost of those habitat units because of because of having to offset in certain situations, offset biodiversity in certain situations. So we're talking about habitat units that can have a value, you know, starting around 20 to 25,000 pounds per unit, but going up to into the hundreds of thousands of pounds for certain habitat types. So you can imagine this multiplier on a unit can have huge, significant costs to site development and to consideration of your biodiversity net gain. So this is why we think this is a really, really important thing to consider, and why we've decided to approach this at scale. If we move to the next slide, before I move on to show some examples, I just want to talk a little bit about ground truthing our satellite data. And this is something that Sam and others will talk a little bit more about later in this presentation. But what we've done is we've visited several hundred sites in order to, with an ecologist, we work very closely with an ecologist to visit several hundred sites to make sure that our satellite data is actually we're calibrating it using that ground truthing data. So we're making sure our satellite data is actually depicting correctly what's going on the ground. That ground truthing allows us not only to calibrate what's going on in the satellite data, but it also allows us to have some confidence in what we're showing. So every bit of data we provide a confidence score associated with that. So you as an end user know how reliable that is. So if we move on to the next slide. So the foundation of what Map Impact have provided is a product called Biodiversity View. And this is a nationwide data set that we've produced. It contains an indication of biodiversity habitat and condition for every 50 metres across all of England. We're supplying it to a really wide range of stakeholders already, and we're very keen to get it into the hands of as many people as we can. So if we move to the next slide, this begins to show what you can start to do with the data due to the scale of it and the level of details. What you have on the left there is the nationwide data set. We have this data available and ready to use anywhere in England. We'll have Scotland and Wales available by March. Those are being worked on at the moment. And this is allowing us to have this very consistent view of what's going on with biodiversity condition on a nationwide basis. What we see in the middle image there is one of the local nature recovery strategy areas. This is Gloucestershire, which is close to where I am. I'm based in Bristol. England is split up into 48 different local nature recovery strategy areas, and we're looking at making this data available to all of those local nature recovery strategy areas, because we think it's a really powerful data source, giving consistency not just within the local nature recovery strategy area to understand what's happening inside there, but also to be consistent with other parts of the country. And then the right-hand side image here is what we look at when we typically drill down to a specific site. So you can see all of the 50-meter, we're using a hexagon approach, so it's 50-meter hexagons, and you can see the level of detail that you're able to get out of this. So this is looking at condition, with light colour being poor condition, dark colour green being good condition. But there's several other attributes in the data. This is available as GIS feeds, so it's available to go alongside all your other data sources as well that you're already using. And then it's also supporting Landmark with some of their reports, which we'll come on to talk about next. The final slide from me is to show where we believe this fits within the workflow. So this is a future homes hub diagram, which we think is really useful for showing. The green bar at the top is the local planning authority process, the blue bar at the bottom, the developer process. And where we think this data fits in, as has already been alluded to by Professor Lee, is it allows this early stage screening to occur. So it allows an initial early stage screening as part of that pre-application process, but then it also allows something objective and consistent for ongoing monitoring and compliance. So it comes in at both ends of the workflow. I'm going to finish there and hand over to Tom, who's joined us to talk about some of the landmark reports.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, Tom Telford from Landmark. I'm a client director here. Purpose of this section is just to provide you with a brief overview of Landmark, what we do here. I then look into the report we provide utilising the mapping impact data, and then just run through 3 case studies at the end. So we are data experts in the land and property sector. We've been in existence for more than 25 years. We manage over 700 data sets, which encompasses more than 1 billion features. And we've already undertaken more than 25 million data searches. So we're experts in data. Next slide, please. We cover a range of sectors and disciplines you may or may not be aware of. Architects, estate agents, environmental consultants, all the way through to surveyors and search providers. And you may be familiar with some of these services we also provide as well. So we currently run the Magic website on behalf of the government. We also provide EnviroCheck reports for phase 1 desk studies to support the contaminated land condition planning applications. We also involved with Flood Re, and also hosted the EPC registers on behalf of the government. And we also have provided historical mapping to over 200 local authorities. They're either used internally within in-house GISs or online via web portals as well. Okay, so looking a little bit more detail into the biodiversity check report. This comes in very early in the project. It's an early pre-site visit screening assessment tool. Can be used by developers, ecologists, environmental consultants, architects, and many more. It's a concise report. It's only 4 pages in length, so straight to the point, and easily attachable to a planning application if required. It provides a habitat identification and condition assessments, and it uses, as already mentioned, the satellite data from Map Impact. There's also the Site Solutions Biodiversity Report, which I believe my colleague Simon or Richard will be coming on to next. And this takes it a step further by extending the scope to include a more detailed analysis. And the next slide should just looping back to the flow chart used earlier on in the presentation. This shows where we envisage the Landmark biodiversity check report sitting. So over the left-hand side, but very early stage pre-application. This is the report. Looking at a site, this is our chalk farm sample site. First page. You have the red line boundary there on the map, together with estimated biodiversity units, which you can just about make out in orange, together with the opportunity as well, so the total number of potential units within that particular site. On the right, you have the biodiversity score, and you also have the habitat performance and coverage in hectares as well. And drilling into a little bit more detail around the habitat, each of these will provide a description of the habitat and also a distinctiveness score attributed to each habitat as well. On the third page, there's the habitat quality overview. So this is a high-level assessment of the relative intensity of biodiversity across the site. This takes the condition and distinctiveness of each habitat into account, and this is particularly useful for helping evaluate possible design solutions and their impact on achievement of biodiversity net gain for a particular site. And then the final page is a report guide or explainer. We try to include a user guide with all the reports we provide to professionals. This breaks down the report and the terminology and provides some further information. So this report is provided as part of a planning application, also to support one. Yeah, there's some useful information in the back of the report for anybody looking at. the particular product. And just to finish off, some current use cases that we have kind of uncovered over the last couple of months at Landmark. We've been working with a couple of architects at this very early stage in the design and planning phase, and they have commented that it's understanding the biodiversity score on a site is particularly useful when assessing where to put properties, buildings, green open space, and the vegetation used. Ecologists, I won't steal your thunder, Sam, but yeah, very early stage, but understanding, particularly for large sites, what's going on and having that information up front is highly valuable. And finally, land developers looking at site selection. If there's a number of sites as potential options to purchase, which one stacks up from a biodiversity point of view, which provides the best opportunity, and also being able to identify any challenges is very important as well. And my colleague Simon, I think, should be on the call, but if not, Richard, are you okay to cover Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. Can't see Simon on the call, so I'm happy to walk through this. This is really a further evolution of what Tom's been talking about with biodiversity check. So the Site Solutions Biodiversity Report provides quite a lot of additional detail on top of the 4 pages that Tom has described. The idea is that, as well as the things that Tom's described in biodiversity check, which are that very initial early site selection and pre-application screening, the Site Solutions report will also support your biodiversity gain plan, support the developer's biodiversity gain plan. So if we can move to the next slide, we can show some examples of what this looks like. So this provides essentially a lot more detail. It's got a sort of more comprehensive understanding, and actually less automation and more input from a qualified professional to produce this report for the developer. If we move to the next slide, you can see this is an example of where the satellite data that I've already demonstrated and that Tom's already talked about comes in. So we have some very similar things to what you see in biodiversity check, which is an understanding of habitats. We know what the breakdown of habitat is with its definitions, and then the site laid out in terms of conditions, so in terms of its condition score that we've talked about earlier on. If we move on to the next slide, this is then broken down into a sort of an easy to use table format, which includes not just the overall biodiversity units of the site, but also a breakdown habitat by habitat of the units within the site. It's also got, it lays out what that distinctiveness score is, specifically habitat by habitat, condition habitat by habitat, and then the units as well. So a lot of additional detail on top of the quick biodiversity check report. If we move on to the next slide, where this is where we think this is very useful is in all of the things that we've already talked about, with this being sort of a highly cost-effective approach. It's very useful for ongoing monitoring. It's highly objective because it brings in that satellite data and it removes some subjectivity from the ecologist, but Sam will talk a bit more to that in a minute. And it's very scalable and very fast. There's also the point on the left on the previous slide. It's worth noting that there's some concerns around, we've heard some concerns around sites being deliberately degraded since the Environment Act was passed now 3 or so years ago. There's potential for that a site to be deliberately degraded so that the BNG units are potentially lower for development. The interesting thing here with satellite data and the tools we're using is that we can begin to look back historically at a site as well to understand what was there previously, so be able to see these situations where this might happen. If we move on to the next slide, coming back to this diagram again, which was the Future Homes Hub PAS diagram, where we see this the Site Solutions Biodiversity Report fitting is actually down in the blue part of this workflow, which is the developer process, and in a similar thing for use at the site selection stage, preparing the net gain plan, but then also with the ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance. I think probably the final slide before I hand over to Sam is actually just a little bit more about ground truthing, which I talked about earlier on, and this is quite interesting. This was one of the first ground truthing exercises that we did in May last year with an academic ecologist and a commercial ecologist. And the interesting thing here was that actually there's quite a lot of subjectivity built into this process, which is something quite interesting to talk about. And again, Sam will come on to talk a little bit more about that when he presents. But our findings here were really interesting in that there was some closeness between the satellite monitoring and the ecologist, but even the ecologist didn't actually agree on everything. So that's a key point there. So I'll now hand over to Sam, who is not Ali Parsons as labelled.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. So I am not Ali Parsons. My name is Sam Durham. I'm Director of Ecology at Lloyd Bohr. So we're an ecology, landscape and arboriculture practice. So I am a practitioner. And so what I'm talking about is why I think this is useful and what we're sort of hoping to get out of this as commercial professional ecologists as well. So you see in the bottom left a sort of image of a small human being in a large area of habitat, which is meant to clumsily illustrate the overwhelmed ecologist and the scale of the task before us. With the introduction of Biodiversity Net Gain, the amount of habitat condition assessment and mapping that's required for planning applications has gone up fairly significantly. That's primarily coming in 3 different ways. So we're used to doing habitat classification. We do that for pretty much every project. What BNG adds is the requirement for condition assessment. That takes quite a decent amount of additional time. So that can really increase the sort of time requirement, the demand on the ecologist for even just a sort of traditional baseline habitat survey. In addition to that, when we are looking at off-site provision of biodiversity units, whether that be through bespoke off-site delivery projects for a development, or strategic habitat banks or strategic sort of habitat delivery projects for local authorities, all of those require additional mapping and classification and condition assessment. So that's added, again, a vast amount of additional mapping. Add to that the fact that lots of landowners are looking at speculative sort of assessments. You know, could we generate biodiversity credits on our land to sell at market to developers? You can see the demands increase really significantly. In addition to that, the monitoring requirements of Biodiversity Net Gain introduce relatively frequent long-term habitat assessment, classification, condition assessment for all development sites and their off-site provision sites. So a lot more. We already have a capacity crisis in the ecology sector, and that's down to a range of factors, including the usual things like COVID, sort of professional burnout of people getting to midway through their careers. It's a very intense job. So we lose a lot of people from the sector right at the point where they're most experienced and most useful for these kind of judgments and this sort of habitat assessment. So there really is a shortage of ecologists, as well as this increased workload. We also, as has been mentioned so far, we have seasonal restrictions on conducting a really robust condition assessment. We can go to a site out of season and make some preliminary assumptions. Quite often they'll have to be quite precautionary and therefore quite high sort of conservative assessments of what the baseline value is. Having the ability to access multiple years of data, multiple years of aerial imagery that's built into these tools is really very useful in terms of progressing sites out of season. Next slide, please. So we get this one. So this is another one of my clumsy graphics. So the snail is representing the ecologist, sort of looking longingly off at the design team who are racing ahead with the project proposals and the spatial planning of those. And I think that's probably all I need to say on that slide, other than it's a Roman snail, which is a protected species if anyone was interested. The problem with that really is that, so whilst there is adaptation and development to do in the development and planning sector, and really embedding the fact that ecologists need to be involved very early on in scheme design, even when that happens, when design and planning teams and clients are starting to actively think about a project, quite often ecologists cannot move fast enough. Given the capacity issues and general workflow patterns, it can take several weeks before we can get an ecologist out to site, and that's pretty common across the sector. There are some ways of addressing that, but largely ecologists can be quite slow to move, quite slow to get to site, and to actually conduct a baseline habitat survey, conduct a condition assessment, and understand our baseline position. So that's a problem for design teams. That can result in spatial planning that's abortive. It can result in lots of other consultants and designers' fees and time being wasted, and it can even result in sort of really quite serious cost implications for a project, even to the point of project feasibility concerns not being recognised until the project design has already progressed away. So we need a way of getting ecologists to a position where they can advise quicker without the kind of all the logistical constraints of having to go out to site and really program in that full day or multiple days for that work. So that is really where I think this comes in. It is a way for us to provide quick, high-level, caveated condition assessments that allow us to start identifying where the sort of high condition, low condition habitats are, and to really start informing our design. We can build that into design models that can be used live on constraints and opportunities plans and on sort of parameter plan development, things like that. We're always, as I think has been touched on, we're caveating that with saying that this is a preliminary view. It's had pretty decent accuracy levels so far. That will be improved with the ground truthing and feedback as the years progress. But it's very useful as that initial tool for sort of, for want of a better term, ranking habitats and understanding where the sort of most valuable may be, and also where the least costly areas to develop may be. The outputs also allow us to populate a preliminary baseline metric calculation, and that then allows the ecologist to go away, play with some development scenarios, say we're going to have 2 hectares of hard standing here, 5 hectares of public open space that we think can be roughly this, and just get some early steers as to likely BNG outcomes or potential BNG outcomes. That is really important for the project design process, just understanding, are we roughly on the right track, getting a more sort of responsive involvement from the ecologist, and that's where this really helps. It can also help speed up the actual on-site baseline habitat classification condition assessment as well. There's an element of obviously the ecologist needing to scrutinise everything that's been generated through these preliminary this preliminary mapping. However, provided that the habitat polygons match up with where the ecologist would have map them. That saves a lot of mapping time on site. So there'll be things we disagree with and want to realign slightly, but largely this will save quite a lot of time in terms of baseline mapping. An additional benefit for us is that ecologists often have to go into quite dangerous and sort of unusual environments. There's an awful lot of habitats that require survey that involve unstable ground or sort of changing water levels, or just physically quite hard to access. There might be other safety concerns. Where that risk is significant, we can't send ecologists into those environments. So we really do need ways of getting sort of more powerful data quicker over those areas that we can't physically inspect. Yes, further down the line we can do things like drone flyovers, but again, that's much more involved, and we're looking for a quick kind of answer up front. As has already been mentioned, this does also provide, in my view, authorities with a more objective, impartial, unbiased sort of output to cross-check against the ecologist's report. So there is, you know, as has been mentioned already, there could be pressure for ecologists to accept what is clearly a deliberately reduced baseline on a site. There could be sort of all kinds of, well, and that does happen across the sector. So obviously that's down to the individual ecological practice maintaining its professional standards, but those pressures are real, they happen, and there can be vagueness and arguments and disagreement about why a habitat is in a condition at the point of baseline survey. It might be apparent that it's been trashed, but really proving that that's unusual and a kind of, or the baseline's been reduced, but proving that's a reduction from the normal status of that habitat can be quite hard. Having this multi-year kind of data set feeding these tools is really useful, both for the ecologist in giving confidence in saying, look, you know, here's an objective report that shows this is what we found, and therefore we think there is a genuine discrepancy here. It also gives the authority that ability to do that if they don't think the ecologist has, or if they think there's a question mark about what's happened to that site. I think, yeah, if we could do next slide. So they're the benefits, and they are the real usefulness as I see it of the tool. And you'll notice in the previous slide there's lots of emphasis on quick and responsiveness. The limitations or the constraints of the tool are, it is a preliminary tool to inform design, to inform all sorts of decision making. Until that ecologist has gone to site and, you know, proof checked, verified on the ground truth, then we don't have a final answer. But that's fine and reflective of the stage of sort of commitment to a project. At very early feasibility and screening stage, many clients, many landowners might just want some answers in principle, and in fact they do generally before they commit to a full consultant team. Is this site feasible? So these tools really come in there. The ecologist then comes in when this, you know, provided this looks favourable and all other standard considerations look favourable for a project, the ecologist comes in, does the site visit, assesses, and then kind of cross-references with the original remote sensed data. The ecologist will also be able to tell what would need to change to improve the condition of that specific habitat area. That's something this tool doesn't do. And also the tool can't assess suitability for protected species. So they are limitations on its usefulness. That's where the ecologist comes in, but these limitations are not really the primary purpose of the tool. It is to get that quick objective overview of condition. And the real, if I haven't hammered it enough as a point, the real benefit, in my view, is the speed and the responsiveness that this allows an ecologist to input to project design and planning, and to help advise clients on potentially budgetary implications. I think that's me done, so I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, Sam. If we can just have the final slide. I haven't just yet got any questions in the chat, so if there are any questions, if you want to write them into the chat, even if we don't answer them now, someone will get back to you about those questions. So I encourage you to do that. I want to conclude by saying that, as Tom has already alluded, Landmark does have a big constituency of clients out there. The sort of clients on the bottom here: developers, lawyers, planning consultants, landowners, and they're regularly providing data around a range of issues, of which BNG is the latest. I think the reason why I'm saying that is that we're already seeing great uptake of what we've got. So I think as local planning authorities, you can expect this stuff to be passing over your desk, which is the primary reason for our explanation of the background workings of it today, so that you can familiarize yourself with it. If you do have any questions about its working, and if you do have any questions or comments really about its utility and what you would like it to do, we would be most grateful to receive those. I still haven't got any questions in the chat. I could just ask a quick one, I think, and it's probably for Tom or for Richard. But I'm intrigued to know about the capacity for machine learning, because you've got a process where you're continually comparing satellite data with things on the ground and with assessments made by ecologists. Is there capacity within the system for the system to absorb that information and to build it into future assessment?
I can take that one, and I would say absolutely there is, Bob. I think Sam's already alluded well to it, that we have some ground truthing that's gone into the current version, and actually what we're intending to do is just continually perform that ground truthing all the time. So there'll be a continuing ground truthing campaign going on to make sure that we're calibrating what we're getting from the satellites correctly, and also verifying the outputs with that confidence score against it. But actually, in collecting all of that data, it's almost feeding the system. So you'll see constant improvement over time as we perform that ground truthing and as we speak to more people. So what we want to have is a feedback loop within the whole process of data production. So in summary, yes, absolutely. I think machine learning is a really important part of this, because ground truthing in one location can help us to understand equivalent locations in other parts of the country.
Great, thank you, Richard. I still haven't got any questions in the chat, but I do encourage you to get in touch if you have got any questions or queries out of things that you've heard today. But otherwise, thank you for attending. I hope you found it useful and informative, and we look forward to providing some product to you across your desk in the very near future indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.